Alright everyone, last night I was having fun antagonizing like the Twitter crowd with the hammer and sickles in their username and Karl Marx banners and stuff. It's fun once in a while to get them going because, you know, they have a tendency to try to dogpile people because part of their mentality, it's like the bash the fash, hashtag resist sort of thing. You know, even if the person that they're attacking is not fascistic in any way, is like a monarchist or something, they think libertarianism is just a different variety of fascism. I don't know how they arrive at this conclusion because they themselves are like, oh yeah, I'm anarcho whatever. I'm an anarcho leftist, I'm an anarcho communist, as though that's a thing, whatever. It's all very funny, but I thought that I would talk thus about some of the problems with Karl Marx. Some of the things he got totally and objectively, provably wrong within the realm of maybe anthropological experience. Because if you've gone to the anthropology courses, you've probably been forced to read some of Marx's ramblings, most of which it's pretty boring. Honestly, there's a lot of anthropological work that's boring anyway. So that's not just his ideology makes it boring. It's just, in general, it's kind of dry and academic. Not everyone's into that sort of writing. Maybe more the antiquated philosophy of 1,000 years before that may be a little bit more interesting to some people. A little more theatrical and flowery than, you know, sort of brutalist in a Karl Marx sense. But the first problem is actually his foundational premise. That is, the theory that he developed into communism, in essence, stems in the primordial sense from the central foundation of primitive communism. His theory, essentially, his hypothesis, because it's not true, and I'll go into why we know, within anthropology, we know for a fact that his primitive communism didn't exist. It's not real. Primitive man had elements of monarchism at times, elements of nationalism, certainly, oligarchic structures, and certainly theocracy, you know, slightly later on, never anything communal in nature. His foundational premise was the concept that communism could definitely work. It's not utopian at all, says Marx, because it's natural to mankind. You know, look at this tribe here. They have, like, you know, no concept of ownership, or so he thought. Now, you've got to understand one thing here before we get into archaeology and its debasement of communism. You have to understand one very, very important thing here. Karl Marx didn't travel out and do field work and go visit primitive tribes, according to his recollection. He was an armchair anthropologist, which meant that he read the stuff other people were doing for field work. What's the problem with that? Of course, those other people may be totally wrong. We talk about that same period of time in the modern sense. People on the left do this all the time. They say, well, it's all basically worthless because it was colonial mumbo-jumbo. It's you know, the noble savage mythology and projection and ethnocentrism and xenophobia and you know, all this other stuff. And later on it seeps into the occult. Sure, you read Rudolf Steiner, you read like Occult Significance of Blood. You're going to get some of this stuff, you know, the theosophy and the spiritualist movement intertwined with anthropology for half a century. Karl Marx, though, is really a product of his period of time. He was an armchair erudite wannabe, essentially, who didn't actually go out and do anything. He was studying things totally secondhand. Therefore, he develops this theory based on secondhand and sometimes tertiary knowledge. We now know that primitive communism is not real. It did not exist. Primitive man was not communistic. If you look at some of the oldest remains, they show too much centrality to have been communistic in the anarchic sense, which he's claiming is the natural offshoot of the natural primitive communism he claims existed anyway. At the same time, you definitely have a sense of family over, you know, a collective community. You have private ownership after fashion. Look at Catalhoyuk. What's Catalhoyuk? It's the earliest recognizable town. It doesn't have streets or anything. They had like weird, you know, tunnels and ramparts and hallways and shit. This sort of went through people's homes. It wasn't the most efficient structure, maybe. And it was rebuilt and apparently had population collapses 5 or 6 times before it was finally abandoned. At Catalhoyuk, we do see a communal structure in the sense that it is technically one solid structure. But it's divided according to the ownership of different families. Different families had their own little honeycomb-like structures. So I believe some had multiple rooms. They had a primitive variant of theocracy, you could say. They had funerary remains that appear to have been repeatedly removed and ritually used, buried around their hearths and things like that. These were kept separate. They weren't all lumped together in one special room. You could say a modern cemetery shows more communalism than the remains at Catalhoyuk. Everyone's sort of just buried together. And you might have a family plot or something within the cemetery, but in general, it's just sort of, it's not really arranged in that way. At Catalhoyuk, though, everyone had their own funerary remains separate from the others. And you see, it's like you look at Göbekli Tepe. You look at archaeology. You look at any of these structures. A communal society wouldn't have had any reason to build something like you see at Göbekli Tepe. What would be the point, essentially? If you're thinking in terms of the anarchic, what's the point of centralizing this apparent style of worship? Why wouldn't it be solely individualistic and or solely communal and rely upon no ownership at all? Certainly, the people who built it didn't want some neighboring group of people to come and destroy it now, did they? It shows a collective ownership in that sense, but it is still ownership. I would say almost the concept of the nation state defeats communism in and of itself just because it happened to develop. But if you look back even 10,000 years, you're looking at people who had some degree of sedentary society, in some cases, that was centered at least around the familial. That is, that they recognized self and not self, which you wouldn't do in communalism, and self as in the family unit as well, apart from others even within your own tribe. And those tribes then being organized into something akin to a small, primitive, tribalistic city-state. We're talking, of course, some of these Copper Age advancements. So that's the first problem. The second problem is pure biology, and that's that humans are innately competitive on a biological level. This is nothing more than evolution. It's nothing more than evolutionary fact. You almost have to suspend belief in everything Darwin wrote in order to be a communist. It's actually very funny because they have that in common with people who like, typically on the right, religious zealots like, the more far out tradcon or something like that. It's almost the same story. It's a denial of science, of the more objective, observable, easily understood side. Evolution in the macroevolutionary sense is just an amalgamation of microevolutions that are directional, in some cases, and if they fail to be properly directional, which can happen by chance, it can happen by all sorts of different effects, then you'd usually have extinction, or at the very least, out-competition, a group is outbred or whatever. That's what you have within human societies too. It's a brutal world. When we look at the world around us, we're lulled into this false sense that it's stable, it's peaceful. It's not. Look at Hawaii right now. This world is constantly at threat of having a massive chunk explode. And this world is constantly at threat of another megafaunal extinction. It's constantly at threat from all sorts of catastrophes. From the moment you're born to the moment you die, you're competing with all other humans for things that humans need. You're also competing to keep yourself from getting consumed by other life forms. When you die, your own gut bacteria will revolt, and because your immune system shuts down, they'll start eating you from the inside out, turn you into soup. Isn't that lovely? No, it's not. It probably sounds quite morbid, but it is reality. That's how it works. Ultimately, human beings have to be competitive. It's innate. Part of that competition takes the form of amalgamation. That's why states exist. That's why the arisal of globalism, unfortunately, I would say this, is more or less inevitable. It was inevitable that the concept would be dreamed up. Now, I think that it's a step backwards in evolution and eventually is defeated, because I think that sort of supreme centrality actually becomes unstable. I think if you break things into nations, those nations have a lifespan too. The globe itself would therefore have its own lifespan, causing calamity maybe a few centuries later. It'd be certainly a dark age indeed. It'd be a little bit like Star Wars, like the fall of the Empire at that point. The problem. Here's the thing though. Human beings will always compete. If you were to develop a communal system, let's say you instituted world communism, you abolished all the nation states, and people don't really have property. They just sort of produce, and then they, each unto, their labor, or whatever the hell it was Marx said. That stupid quote, basically. From each according to his labor to each according to his need, or something along those lines. Some bullshit. But, let's say you managed to do so. Okay, you've gone back to supposedly a primitive period. What will happen is that the whole thing will replicate itself over again. The nation state will eventually be born. Some group, by chance alone, will be alienated from other groups. schism off and develop, a more centralized state in order to outcompete everyone around it. That'll force the others to do the same. Pretty soon you have the same problems that the communists see with maybe the world today. And then you have number 3. And this is one that doesn't get discussed much. It's easy, it's low-hanging fruit to target primitive communism. It's low-hanging fruit to talk about biological evolution, but what comes from biological evolution? Cultural evolution, taking off from the end of the last point here. Cultures evolve as well, over time. They are thus subject to competition as well. The nation state is simply innate. The concept of nations is more innate and natural as an extension of human biology, of evolution itself, than the concept of its abolition. It's actually natural. It's natural for man to slowly amalgamate power structures and centralize things. It's a problem within bureaucracy, trust me. There's a problem within the USSR's bureaucracy too. Thus, over time, things are either destroyed or they get reformed. If you don't continuously do that, things become unstable. Again, why globalism, I think, loses long term. This is something that libertarians would point out. It is biologically natural for that amalgamation to occur. It's in balancing it. It's at finding some sort of stability between the two extremes. The ANCAP may not care if there's communist-style anarchy, which is, oddly enough, there's some similarity. I know you have capitalism. Okay, so it's an anarcho-communist society with factories. Okay. I don't see a huge difference other than more smog, but all right. The monarchist would say you have to find a balancing point between the two. You have to find a point, preferably, that increases stability and efficiency. See, a little bit of bureaucracy, a little bit of order and nation state creates massively better efficiency than having none at all. That's why it arose. It's an evolutionary advantage to amalgamate along those lines. The tribalistic, it doesn't really matter what the form of governance is. That's a separate issue. I have my own feelings on that, but it's semi-separate. However, as you advance along, it becomes almost cancer-like. That is, what was once an advantage has become a burden. It's like within evolution, you'd think. Turtle's shell. Turtle's shell gives it protection. So what about having more shell? It must be great, wouldn't it? But eventually the turtle can't move. It's going to starve to death. If a mutant arises that has a triple thick shell, it may not actually be able to survive. Now you'd think, if you were using the logic of certain groups of people, you'd think, well, more shell is always better. More shell, more protection. Takes energy to make it. It takes energy to field it. You have to be able to actually have motility. That's, you've strangulated another aspect of your survival by fixating on one too much. This is also, by the way, an argument against central planning. Because in central planning, you can make that same basic mistake. You've got to let some things play out on a private marketplace. So those are just some thoughts about communism. Generally, communists don't, it's like some people are like, well, you platform, the alt-right by, you never talk to leftists other than, H.A. Goodman, who they now consider to be far-right, I guess. They had something on there about him being an extremist the other day, and I was laughing my ass off. I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? Have you even listened to his work? But, yeah, other than he swears a little bit more now because he's been alienated by the progressives who keep calling him names for daring to point out that the DNC has issues. Oddly enough, on that, the communists probably wouldn't fault him. Most of them hate the Democratic Party, too. They're like, oh, you mean those Republicans with a D after their name? Yeah, we hate them, too. At the very least, they're consistent. Okay. If they're more purist, they're more consistent. Totally disagree with your worldview, but yeah, at least you're not a hypocrite. That's good, I suppose. Well, not a hypocrite on that, anyway. You know what I mean. So, yeah, there's a little bit about communism. Wish I could debate some communists. That'd be funny. Then people would say I was platforming them. I had a comment the other day to show how the paradigm is slowly grinding down and beginning to maybe turn a little bit. The other day I had somebody again comment, say that I was like a long-haired hippie and I needed Jesus and stuff. It's been a while, actually. Mostly I get flack only from the left these days. It's been a while since I managed to piss off evangelocons. It's sort of a dying breed, I guess. We need more religious zealots in the country so that someone can try to troll me and provide me with entertainment. I need more of it, damn it. I need some rage every day in order to keep myself going. Yeah, man does not live on coffee alone. That's about all. Peace out.